make a financial agreement with her or with her mother, and establish a comfortable, if from a metropolitan perspective, an irregular household. As we have noted, however, colonial discourses rarely speak with a consistent voice. Having detailed the vital services mulattoes performed, Long commenced a bitter attack, recasting them, having just said they were demure and pure and helpful and new herbs, etc. He then started to recast them as common prostitutes, and quote, the bastard mothers of a bastard race. The mulatto, Long now insisted, was a deceitful, avaricious creature whose sexual extravagance rendered her white patron the abject, passive slave to all her insults, threats, and infidelities. Mulattoes were leechers, their embraces well-dissembled affection, tricks, cajolements, designed to obscure her infidelities. Mulattoes uniformly hated all whites, Long continued. Mulattoes were their real sexual favorites. At the planter's death, his mulatto concubine would shamelessly, quote, disperse his estate among her and between her and her brats, whom he blindly acknowledges for his children, when in truth they are entitled to claim 20 other fathers. In sentences dripping with contempt for both the mulatto and her white patron, Long continued, Europeans who at home have always been used to notice there's a very different tone to Anglophone and Francophone writing about sexuality. Europeans who at home, Long writes, have always been used to greater purity and strictness of manners, are too easily led aside to give a loose to every kind of sensual delight. On this account, some black or yellow kashaba is fought for by whom a tawny breed is produced. Many are the men of every rank, quality, and degree here who would much rather riot in these goatish embraces than share the pure and lawful bliss derived from matrimonial mutual love. Although we've just been told that they can't afford that. Gone are the acknowledgments of her tender nursing, her fidelity, her demure public behavior. Gone as well the demographic and economic factors that made concubinage ubiquitous. Like Moreau, Long placed responsibility for métissage and the licentious white male behavior it evoked squarely at the door of the sexually driven and uncontrollable mulatto. Long's projection of the license and libertinage onto the mulatto had the same purpose as Moreau and Ruthven's, to displace metropolitan criticisms of white Creoles as arrogant, dissipated, extravagant, self-indulgent onto an imaginary figuring of the mulatto as the cause of all their fall from grace. However, I propose that Long and later Brian Edwards displace white male Creole behavior onto the mulatto for another important reason, to repair an ideological defect within British colonial discourses that Long and Edwards, among many others, were responsible for perpetuating. A vision of white Creoles and their culture as the antithesis of British virtue, respectability, and civility. Seeking British metropolitan acceptance, these writers had adopted metropolitan discourses about the colonies, including criticizing white Creole men as arrogant and hot-tempered, dissolute, averse to serious thought and deep reflection, extravagant and intemperate. This is what Long writes about his fellow planters. White Creole wives and daughters fared no better, being depicted as indolent, morally degenerate, slovenly, infertile, and given to languor and lassitude, unless roused to savage rage by their husbands' multiple dalliances with women of color. Then the plantation mistress would strike out with unmitigated cruelty. Stories of the tortures white women inflicted upon slave women reached mythic levels, as a tale of the plantation mistress who beheaded her husband's concubine and served her head to him at dinner demonstrates. Significantly, the same tale was told about a plantation mistress in Jamaica Zenderman, and Suriname. Although partly responsible for the dissemination of these stories, Long smarted under these attacks, especially since they were used to assert white Creole's inability to exercise rational self-control and thus claim the right to greater colonial self-governance. When the U.S. declared its independence from Britain, the West Indian planters said, well, we want some of that too. And then their answer was, but you're hot-tempered, dissolute, extravagant, etc., and don't deserve it. Now, what better way to repair the planters' elite self-image and reassert white civility and superiority than to displace metropolitan criticisms of white Creole men and women onto representations of the sexually depraved and duplicitous mulatto? As in Saint-Domingue, the mulatto concubine mistress became the tabooed abject other who marked white society's racial superiority. But as always, colonizing discourses speak with multiple voices. Projecting white female depravity onto the mulatto concubine had two unintended but damning effects. Creole licentiousness and corruption now appeared to reach from the highest to the lowest ranks of island society, while the differences Long struggled to establish between white Creoles on the one hand and mulattoes and black on the other, evaporated as all Caribbean, white and non-white, stood condemned before the bar of British public opinion. As tellingly, however, Long could not sustain his critiques of the mulatto. To begin with, Long spoke out passionately against the legal condemnation of the offspring of white men to slave status. In other words, he said, it really isn't fair that some white guy's kids automatically should be slaves because their mother was a slave, which is the law. Rather like Moreau, Long recommended freeing mulatto children at birth, giving them a moral and Christian education, a big deal with the Brits, training them in an artisanal craft and incorporating them into a colonial third estate. In this way, he argued, a group who otherwise would be isolated on the margins of Creole society would be transformed into an important, productive members of that society. Mulattoes are by nature, Long argued in words reminiscent of Moreau's, a haughty race, capable of undergoing equal fatigue with the blacks, above whom, in point of due policy, they ought to hold some degree of distinction because of their white blood. They would then form the center of connection between the two extremes, producing a regular establishment of three ranks of men, dependent on each other and rising in proper climax of subordination in which the whites would hold the highest place. They could serve the colony in multiple ways, as, quote, orderly subjects and faithful defenders of the country, as assistants to white craftsmen and tradesmen, as a military contingent adept at containing threats from rebellious slaves, whose natural enemies they would now become, and maroon encampments. So the same fantasy that Moreau has, the Edward Long has. Now Brian Edwards wrote a little bit afterwards and was involved in the Haitian Revolution, trying to put down the Haitian Revolution. Brian Edwards went further than Long, and he was a planter and a lawyer, had an estate in England as well as in Jamaica. Now, he went further than Long, offering sympathy and understanding to the mulatto concubine. Stigmatized from birth by white society, deprived of education and a Christian upbringing, with few economic opportunities other than concubinage, so no white man of decent appearance will condescend to give his hand in marriage to a mulatto. The very idea is shocking, Edwards wrote. What options did they have? Let it not offend any modest ear, Long wrote, and Moreau and the Francophone were never very worried about offending modest ears, as the Brits are. Let it not offend any modest ear if I add my opinion that the unhappy females here spoken of are much less deserving reproach and reprehension than their keepers, excluded as they are from all hope of ever arriving to the honor and happiness of wedlock, insensible of its beauty and sanctity, ignorant of all Christian and moral obligations, threatened by poverty, urged by their passions, and encouraged by example. Upon what principle can we expect these ill-fated women to act otherwise than they do? Neither should it be forgotten that very few of these poor females are guilty of that infamous species of profligacy and prostitution which flourishes without principle or shame throughout the cities of Europe. So they're not as bad as white prostitutes, which is interesting. More virtuous than European prostitutes, pressed by economic necessity, devoid of viable alternatives to mulatto concubine, called for Brian Edwards' white sympathy. The effect of Edwards' sympathetic, indeed empathetic presentation, whether intentionally or not, it is difficult to say, was to question the basic nature of racial difference. Edwards appears to be asking, how much do racial differences depend on innate biological differences, which would be Moreau's argument, and how much on social circumstances, and therefore one capable of change? Did Edwards in fact threaten to erode even further the boundaries distinguishing the races? And still the rhetorical confusions continue. We can have a picture in a moment. Having deployed the language of the sentiments to present the mulatto as worthy and demure object of white sympathy, Edwards again reverses fields, ending his discussion of the mulatto by reprinting Ode to the Sable Venus, a scandalous poem dedicated to Edwards by his Jamaican tutor and mentor, the Reverend Isaac Teal, a poem explicitly designed to offend the modest ear. Moving from bad to worse, Edwards accompanied Teal's poem with an engraving of the Sable Venus that mimics. Now, how do I turn this off? So the ignorant here. Oh, here. There she is. The Sable Venus. And that is, of course, modeled after Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. She, as I said, mimics Botticelli's Venus, a voluptuous beauty rising naked from the sea. And so the mulatto reappears not as a vulnerable and sympathetic woman, but again as the endlessly available seductress. And I will quote very briefly from the poem. The wanton breezes fanned her breast. Her skin excelled the raven's plume. This is what the Reverend Teal is sending as a poem to his young male protege. The wanton breezes fanned her breast. Her skin excelled the raven's plume. Her breath the fragrant orange bloom. Soft was her lip as silken down. She smiled with kind consenting eyes, and it was okay with her. The tridents sound, the sirens sing, the billows ring, when her step has touched the strand in Jamaica. Wild rapture seized the ravaged land. From every part they came, gay goddesses of the sable smiles, propitious still this grateful isle with thy protection bless. This is really a discussion of the slave trade and the Middle Passage, but in this sexualized, fantastic rendition. That it says, in fact, that this is her consenting eyes that permitted the Middle Passage and the transfer of slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean. Need I say more? Again, we see representations of the enslaved woman, the mulatto, used to bear responsibility for colonial libertage, at the same time as she confirmed racial difference, patriarchal dominance, and social order within a colonial world. Now, I do think we can take a decent break now, and then I want to discuss this one novel, Zellica, which has so much transgression going on in it, it's dizzying. So, but I think we'll have fun with it. So, shall we have, what time is it? We have another hour, right? No, but half an hour?
12 to 12:30. Actually, also could leave some time for discussion, so it ends at 12:30, right? Or 12 o'clock? Or 12 o'clock, yeah.
12 o'clock. Oh, it ends at 12? I thought it was. Okay, well, you will not hear about Zellicoe. However, I can send Ray a copy of this if you want to read about Zellicoe.
Okay.
Because it's a very exciting novel.
I think you could go into 15. Would you like to?
It's a complicated document. I thought I had another.
Okay.
Okay, so questions? I'm afraid I read the more tedious part of the talk. It's going to end on a high note. But anyway, you do get the Sable Venus
Yeah, right.
as a lunch break. And anything else to be discussed? What I'm trying to do is to really sort of weave this way of thinking about race relations in the Caribbean, to weave that into a discussion of liberalism's difficulties with dealing with difference, and what are some of the contradictions with liberal political thought as it emerged during the Age of Revolution, which was in fact this very contentious period, many disagreements among both liberals and anti-liberals, but how one can look at this and see the